Welcome to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change, where we bring you stories of real people working to address real issues. I am your host, Shimon Cohen. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Dawn Belkin Martinez, who is the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and a clinical professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Dr. Martinez explains the Liberation Health model, which she co-created as an approach that utilizes a sociopolitical framework for assessment of what is causing problems for people and intervention techniques to help them live better. She shares the incredibly interesting history of the model, which started in a hospital inpatient psych unit in collaboration with patients and their families. You need to hear the story directly from her, but the model is rooted in a mix of transformative liberatory approaches Brazilian mental health practitioners were using at the time, as well as radical counseling and social work, Black feminism, and Marxist theory that Dr. Martinez, Nelson Ochoa, and colleagues studied together. Dr. Martinez breaks down how to use the model, explaining the assessment process using what is called the Liberation Health Triangle, and the intervention tools and techniques such as deconstructing dominant worldview messages and rescuing the historical memory of change. She shares examples and stories from her own experience applying the model. In addition to the sociopolitical analysis, assessment, and intervention techniques, I love how the model encourages practitioners to engage with clients in ways that feel much more authentic, the transformative approach of action for change once clients feel ready, and how it is deeply rooted in collective liberation. Additionally, it is flexible enough to incorporate various approaches within the model, as long as they are connected to the larger approach. Dr. Martinez and I get into all of this, as well as how to learn more and get involved. I hope this conversation inspires you to action. Before we get into the interview, I want to let you all know about our episode's sponsor, the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. First off, I want to thank them for sponsoring the podcast. UH has a phenomenal social work program that offers face-to-face master's and doctorate degrees, as well as an online and hybrid MSW. They offer one of the country's only political social work programs and an abolitionist-focused learning opportunity. Located in the heart of Houston, the program is guided by their bold vision to achieve racial, social, economic, and political justice, local to global. In the classroom and through research, they are committed to challenging systems and reimagining ways to achieve justice and liberation. Go to www.uh.edu/social work to learn more. And now, the interview. Hey, Dawn, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm a big fan of the work you're doing, and I'm just really glad that we're finally getting to connect and get you on here.
Thank you so much, Shimon. And I just want to say the same. I have been following your work for a long time. We share a lot of your podcasts here at the School of Social Work at BU, and I'm hoping to continue our work together.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm using Liberation Health stuff in the work that I do with my co-instructor, Charlotte Yearwood. So I'm really excited to have you on here and get into this Liberation Health model. I think it's really revolutionary and can just help people in our field and related fields, really need this. So let's just jump right in with what is the Liberation Health model?
So the Liberation Health model is a socio-political form of, it was developed for social work practice, but of course it could be used by anyone in, public health or community organizing or any of the other mental health professions. But what it is a model of practice that involves both a socio-political assessment of what's going on with the person. So I'm trained as a clinical social worker, so people come to see me. I have a small practice. Usually something's going on in their life. It's not, going well. They want some help. They want some therapy. And this Liberation Health framework is a socio-political assessment frame, which assesses the personal and the ideological, cultural factors and the institutional factors influencing their life and influencing their problem and the relationship with the problem. And then I think most importantly, it's a method. It's a direct method of practice, interventions that are very specific around sociopolitical types of techniques and interventions that an individual can become involved with their family, with their community, with the larger, sort of place that they're living.
Yeah. So I know we're going to get into like a lot of how it functions and how to use it as best we can, obviously, like on a podcast episode, because it could be its own series, really, breaking it down, right? But let's talk about how it was created, because you've let me know that it's an interesting story, the way this came about.
Yes, it is a very interesting story because it was created, the Liberation Health framework and method was created sort of alongside of the people that are the most directly impacted by mental health issues. And I can tell you the story. It's kind of a cool story because I was working before I started, working in academia. I was a family therapist. I'm trained as a family therapist, and I worked in a very large hospital in Boston. And I was the chief social worker on the inpatient psychiatry unit, and sort of responsible for supervising and providing family therapy. And one of the things this hospital frequently did, which is pretty typical of most big, large teaching hospitals, was to administer consumer satisfaction surveys for patients and their families. And in the case of ours, it was mostly the family that was filling out the consumer satisfaction survey because many of the patients were younger. And then the hospital would sort of compare and contrast each department in how satisfied the patients were. And what happened where I worked was that we actually scored very low in the sort of consumer satisfaction survey. And parents were, remember, this is on the inpatient psychiatry unit, so that comes with a lot of, dominant worldview messages of what parents are doing or not doing. Mm-hmm. So parents reported in the consumer satisfaction survey that they felt judged, that they felt people didn't really think they were good parents, that they didn't work with them, that they made mistakes, and were not eager to sort of continue follow-up based on their experience. And my department took that really seriously, took the sort of this feedback seriously. And at the time, it's really interesting because at the time, the medical director of the department was a white, cisgendered, older psychiatrist. He certainly wasn't involved in any kind of alternative movement around mental health. And he's trained as an analyst, but he was very concerned that the families were not happy. And he said to me, do you have any ideas about, what we can do and what sorts of interventions we could make here on our inpatient psychiatry unit? And at that time, I had just gotten back from Brazil and trained at the sort of with people from the Paulo Freire Institute, and we're doing a lot of organizing and alternative mental health response in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and had an amazing experience there. And I was already looking for something because I was an activist way before I was a social worker. So I was already looking for something to add to the psychodynamic training that I received, because I felt like it was important, but it also left out a lot of really crucial factors in how people relate to the world and how they see themselves and how the world relates to them. So kind of following the trip to Brazil, I talked with a really good friend of mine who was in the same graduate program, Nelson Ochoa. And I said, you know what, like, I'm thinking like we could do something that is similar to what they're doing in Brazil, and, look at different systems and theories and conceptual frameworks and think about how we can apply them here to our practice here in, the Boston area. Because of course, Porto Alegre is a very different context than Boston. So we got together with, at that point, it was just a few social workers. This was maybe 3 or 4 of us. And we started sort of doing a lot of reading together, looking at conceptual frameworks. We spent a lot of time reading the work of Antonio Gramsci, Paulo Freire, Ignacio Martin Barro, our own radical rank and file social worker, Bertha Capon Reynolds, the Combahee River Collective, Black feminist movements. And we sort of put together a model that we thought would address the sort of holistic picture of what people are experiencing. And then I think the cool part of the story is that because I was working on this inpatient psychiatry unit, we tested out the model with the families that were interacting with the staff and experiencing, having their children hospitalized. And the families were our best teachers because we went through about 5 or 6 different tools to develop our assessment tool, right? Because the families would say, "Oh, this is too complicated," or like, "I'm not going to fill out all these boxes," or the Bronnenfeller model makes sense, but like, I'm not going to, I'm not going to do all that. So we came up with this assessment tool, which we call the triangle, our triangle of analysis that we use with everybody. And then again, with the people most directly affected, the families that had their loved ones on the unit, we developed the interventions, which were around deconstructing sort of dominant worldview messages, introducing new information, rescuing historical memory of change, which I can talk about in a little bit. But that was, I think, in my opinion, that's the coolest thing about the model, is I like to say that it wasn't developed in a lab. It wasn't developed in somebody's head. It was developed with the community at the front and center.
Yeah, it's incredible because it was like all these things had to come together at the right time, right? Like you were in that position. The surveys had been bad. Like if the surveys weren't bad, this maybe never would have come to be, right? And then you have to have leadership that wants change and is invested and lets you do something, because this, especially in an inpatient psych, I mean, this is like way out there, right? I mean, to bring in sociopolitical, right? Instead of just the problem residing, right? They just need medication, right? I mean.
Yeah. And I remember it was really funny because we started using it, and surprise, surprise, the consumer satisfaction scores went right up. Right. People were very happy. And our medical director was interviewed on some radio program, and they were sort of getting into the theory and talking about Antonio Gramsci, who's was a Marxist, right? And so he said, I'll never forget, he said something to the effect of, "Well, I can't say I really understand that much about the theory, but I do know that the families are really happy, and we're getting, our scores are really high. So I'm very happy to introduce this model on our service."
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. So as you share the story, you kind of got into some of this, but I just want to ask, like, other ways this model is, the liberation health model is different from the medical model, or just other kind of like problem folk, right? So much of like how we're trained as clinicians, and I think beyond just clinical too, for social work, is we get trained to see problems, right? But often where the problem resides then is often what's up for debate, I guess, in a way. So just kind of how, I mean, you talked about a little bit that it's, sociopolitical, and you got this triangle, but maybe you can start getting into a little bit more of like what that looks like.
Sure. So we usually start with, it's a very specific method that we used. It's an assessment and intervention method that involves people identifying first, right, what's getting in the way of their optimal level of functioning, right? What's getting in the way of them living the life they want to live, right? And for me as a family therapist, that could take a long time to flesh out, because if you've got 5 people in the room and everybody thinks it's something else, and often people, because of our individualistic culture and here, will blame other people. It's my mother, or it's my brother, or it's my sister. So liberation health social worker first works to flesh out an externalized vision of the problem, something that's not located in a person. So it's, it could be something like depression or communication problems. We work with people to sort of externalize what it is that's getting in the way of them living in their preferred life. And that's really the first step. And once we do that, we start with our problem analysis. It's probably my favorite part of the assessment process, which is the liberation health triangle. And in that, we actually have a triangle that we do with people, that we complete with people. And whether it's on Zoom or in person, it involves putting the identified problem in the middle of the triangle. So let's suppose you've been working with a father and a daughter, and, the initial sort of understanding of the problem is my dad's a jerk, or my daughter doesn't listen. We will have worked with you to sort of externalize what it is that's going on that's getting in the way of, you and your daughter doing well. And that might be communication, right? That might be communication. So if we identify communication, that goes in the middle of the triangle. And then the first part of that is identifying the personal factors that influence the problem. That's pretty easy for people to do because I think that's the medical model, right? So if there's any history of loss or any history of trauma or any kind of medical illness or psychiatric illness or conflict or, all of those sort of things, typical medical model, that goes on the P part of the triangle. The second part of the triangle is much more challenging for people because a lot of times they're not used to thinking this way. So we'll talk about dominant worldview messages. We use the word culture, which are probably going to change in the next edition of the book, because culture for us is not the food you eat or what you wear. It's what Antonio Gramsci talked about, the dominant worldview messages that we are exposed to that influence how we think about things. So we might ask questions about gender and how the kinds of messages we get about how cisgendered men are influenced to communicate. Or we might ask questions about individualism, right? That's sort of like this sort of dominant worldview message that if you have a problem, you're supposed to take care of it on your own. Or you might ask questions about, race, right? Racism and how racism has impacted your understanding of communication, what you've experienced in your school, things like that. So all of these, like what I would say, isms, sexism, racism, classism, individualism, professionalism, all of those kinds of questions are sort of part of the analysis of the sort of cultural piece on the triangle. And then finally, the institutional factors. And when we think about institutions, we think about, buildings, right? Systems, right? So the housing system, right? The capitalism, it's like there's no living wage under capitalism. The education system, the healthcare system, the justice, quote unquote, justice system. And all of those different factors, right, are what influence your experience of the problem. That is very different than the medical model, which probably for the most part only focuses on the personal factors influencing the problem. And then what I would say, even with the sort of ecological frame that social work has, right, it's a conceptual framework and it doesn't go beyond like that, right? Oftentimes it's just about understanding the sort of ecological factors, but it's not around intervening around these ecological factors. And this is a very big piece of liberation health, the intervention around these cultural and institutional factors. So what we like to say in in liberation health, sort of borrowing from Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, is that, our method of practice addresses the cop in the street, right? The external factors, and the cop in your head, the cop in your head that has internalized all of those oppressive messages.
Yeah, I love it because, we've talked about this, but I also got into social work through like activism. And I think some of it got trained out of me, as I was like trained. I'm actually not like opposed to CBT. I think there's aspects of CBT that when it goes deep enough and really looks at like what you're talking about these larger dominant cultural message, right? Because if someone has a core belief, it's like, well, what formed that?
Right.
So if it gets connected to those bigger, like there's some overlap with that part, but the part about the institutions, right? And then like, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about interventions. Because even with like a lot of these counseling frameworks, for lack of a better term, it's always still like, well, but I can only control me, you know? It's kind of like I can only, which in some ways is true in a way, but we know when we unite with other people, we can create change, right? So I'm really like, let's go into that with the interventions. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so that's great. So again, that's a really big difference between the liberation health method and sort of more traditional ecological frames. It's very focused on the doing, addressing the cop in the street and the cop in your head. So we identify 4 different sort of categories of interventions that we engage with. And the first one is like just identifying the dominant worldview message, right? You know, like if you sort of, think this is, I don't know, if dad, let's take this dad, and he was behaving in a certain way, and those sort of behaviors were very much based on dominant worldview messages around gender and how men are supposed to communicate and men are supposed to behave. The first step is really understanding that, right? Sort of like, getting this, so what is the dominant worldview message about men and how they're supposed to behave and how they're supposed to communicate, and how do you think that that's affected you, right? So that's the first step. It's like identifying the dominant worldview message. The second step is deconstructing that message, like, deconstructing it, taking it apart. And that's can be really hard when people have believed something for 40 years or 50 years. Like, I'm just supposed to behave this way as a man. I'm supposed to, that's what men do. They man up, so on and so forth. So that deconstruction is sometimes quite tedious, because you kind of have to slog through it and sort of pull out different threads of what people say and sort of help to sort of see, this is who benefits when you think this way. So when you think that men are not supposed to share their feelings, because if you do, you're kind of like not, being a guy, who benefits from that? Who loses? Who gains, right? So that deconstruction is a really important piece of things. And then finally, the third step is introducing new information, right? There's lots of ways that men can behave. There's lots of ways that men can communicate. One of the cool things about, right, social media is that you don't have to work very hard to find people doing these kind of like introducing new information interventions. And you just go on the web together and you say, wow, here's this dad's group that's doing all this. This is amazing. They sort of rejected, the idea that men have to be silent and not communicate and not be, sort of talk about their feelings. And then finally, the last step, it's not sequential, I'm just talking about them as 4 steps, is activism as a therapeutic intervention, acting in the world. And we believe that we need to change. It's not enough to change the cop in your head. We need to change the material conditions in the world, right? And so that means getting involved in organizing that. And that there's been a number of studies, right, that indicate activism and organizing is actually a therapeutic intervention, because you're working in a collective, you're working with other people that feel the same way you do. You're gaining skills, you're getting confidence in your worldview, all these sorts of things. So that's a big piece of it. And so as liberation health practitioners, that is a large component of what we do. We're involved in the world around union organizing, around housing justice, around creating this alternative mental health crisis response model in Boston. So that's just as much of what we do as the sort of cop in the head stuff.
And are the folks that you're working with, clients, participants, I mean, I know there's different terms, people, are they're involved in, like, if, let's say you're going to do some housing justice work and housing organizing, because obviously that's going to be an issue that's like really stressing people out, right? Like, I mean, that's enough to like cause a whole host of problems, right? Housing. Are you then showing up together at different organizing activities?
Yes, we do. We have a very strong presence. We have a banner, so it's easy to find us. I will say, and I think this is fair to share, that when people are beginning in the process, often the activism is sort of like the last piece of things, because they're just, at a place where they don't have a lot of energy. They're usually feeling bogged down by the sort of identified problem. And the first thing is really, I find working on the cop in the head really is important, right? Because it sort of liberates you to have more energy that you can get involved in other things. Now, there are people that right away, hey, when's that rent control rally? I want to go, right? But I would say that's not common. And lots of times people need a little bit of the sort of cop in the head work before they're able to sort of get out and sort of become an activist in the different ways that you can be an activist. And we don't see activism in a narrow sort of method. We see lots of different ways that you can do activism. And I just wanted to pick up, I really appreciated what you said about CBT, because another cool thing about Liberation Health is we don't see it as a standalone intervention. We see it as something you can do in, conjunction with other kinds of treatment modalities. And, a colleague of mine here at BU who teaches as an expert in CBT, is now teaching the CBT triangle along with the Liberation Health triangle at the same time.
That's really cool. A colleague of mine, Charla, I think she uses, I don't know how she would exactly describe it, but she uses a mix of she uses some ACT therapy approaches, but also Liberation Health, but also her own kind of stuff that she wants to write up at some point, because it's really interesting what she's doing. One thing that I want to bring up is, for a clinician to do this work, right? There's already had to be a lot of cop in the head work because what you're saying, just the piece, and this is the part that I think was so drilled into me in school, and even reinforced in social work in the community, right? Because you don't want to lose your job, right? You got have that job. And then I was faculty, and it was again reinforced, is this very separated, which, if I want to name the dominant cultural ideology, it's white middle class or white upper middle class approaches, hetero approaches of that, we can just be separate from clients, right? And then it would be actually some dual relationship, right? To go to do community work together, which to me is it's really problematic, right? To that's what's being mostly trained. So how do you address that part as you're training people and teaching students about this? And I'm just kind of wondering the response you get around that type of stuff.
Yeah, that's probably the most common pushback we get. I mean, not so much anymore, just because I think the world is so desperate. People are a little bit more open-minded. But certainly when we began giving presentations, especially in hospitals, it would often be more traditional mental health providers, psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers too, quite frankly, that would say, you're not supposed to, kind of talk about these sort of things. You're not supposed to, bring up capitalism in the session for the young man that has an impulse control problem, right? And what's interesting about that is that, of course, we're always bringing up things that we think are important, and the clients may not have thought about it. That happens all the time.
Right.
It just, when you start doing it with politics, it's counter-hegemonic, as Gramsci would say. And so then you get, why are you doing this? But lots of times people would ask about, I don't know, people's spiritual practices, or they would ask about, when I worked in the hospital, providers were constantly bringing up medication all the time before a client had even thought about something like that. And they were like, why are you asking me about medication? So what I would sort of say is that we're always bringing up sort of things that we think are important, and that this isn't any different than that. This is just bringing up something that's not kind of hegemonic in the current, mental health mainstream. When I was trained, very psychodynamically, I was taught you're never supposed to really say anything about yourself. You're just supposed to sort of, just,
Right.
kind of validate and reflect back. Um, and, even if someone asked you a question, you're supposed to sort of like ask them why they asked you it. And that I think is one way to do the work, right? And it reflects a particular set of beliefs and values and norms. And those are dominant, right? They're currently dominant. But what I would say is that the sort of asking questions, like the work of Ignacio Martin Barro, right, and Paulo Freire and Bertha Capon Reynolds, it's becoming an opening right now to sort of say that this is not forbidden, this is not wrong. It's important to ask about racism to this young kid that has the anger management problem, right? Because that's a factor. That's just as much of a factor about why he might be clocking people as, what happened in his home. Or I would go further and say what happened in his home is related to legacies of racism, classism, so on and so forth, right? So like people are made by society. People are created by these dominant worldviews. And unless you're addressing them, you're missing, in my mind, 2/3 of the picture. So we try to communicate that in our classes here at, with my colleagues. But it's, it hasn't been easy. And I was asked to leave a job, so for doing that. So I do think it's getting a little bit easier just because the changing, how so much the world, right, is changing, and that, people are starting to question taken for granted assumptions that they've had about mental health and what constitutes good mental health for right now.
Yeah, I think like historically, right, there's always been people within communities doing healing work and political organizing together. I mean, it goes way back, right? And so, more contemporary, which isn't like so contemporary anymore, but like, I always think about the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords, and like,
right.
I mean,
That's
right.
right.
And like, they got like alternative medicine in like hospitals in New York.
That's right.
And the Panthers were doing sickle cell testing, and along with policing the police, right? And community self-defense and free breakfast and all this. So it's really only been this like kind of top down, like really a white European approach to mental health and social work that's like been imposed really.
Absolutely.
As this is the way to do it, when all these other, like, I don't want to say all people of color because that's not accurate, but like a lot of communities of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, brown folk, Latinx, have always been doing this.
Yeah.
There's
concealed stories among many different groups of people and over a long period of time of this kind of work being done. And even within social work, right? I mean, Bertha Capon Reynolds started out as an analyst, and then she got involved in, trying to change systems and challenging, oppressive capitalist policies. And then she was fired from Smith for doing that, right? And now, of course, they have a scholarship to her name. But, there have always been people in many different areas that have been doing this work. And part of, I think, a really key component of the work is rescuing the historical memory of change, right? How do we let people know this is not new? As you said, the Panthers are not new. The Young Lords are not new. The work of Paulo Freire is not new. And like, how do we take those stories that have been hidden, and kind of like concealed, and sort of bring them to light so that people can feel inspiration and hope, and when thinking about what healing really looks like.
100%. So when you've used this with folks, right? Like, I know you're kind of giving like a maybe hypothetical story of the father and the daughter, right? Which I'm sure that story that type of scenario happens all the time. Especially I think back to that inpatient unit you were talking about. It was like, what is some of this look like, with, like, if you could just share more, like, about what some of this kind of ends up looking like.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what case to share, and I think I'll share a case that we've written about just because we had the permission to do that. But this was someone that was, this was a long time ago, so I think I probably do things very differently. But even then, was hospitalized on our inpatient psychiatry unit for self-harm behavior, like a lot of self-harm behavior, and engaged in what different unusual ways to seek help, right? And so, when the person was admitted to our hospital and had this history of like 13 or 14 other hospitalizations, a lot of judgments are made, right? And people are talk about people in a way that reflects the medical model, right?
Can we name some of those? Because, like, I want folks who are listening, like, for example, the term frequent flyer.
Mm-hmm.
That's like
mm-hmm.
a horrible thing to call a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that mean? Someone who's abusing the system, right? Like,
Right.
because, like, when this person needs help, like, who wants to really be institutional? Right? So I just think it's important for us to, like, name some of this stuff too. So, like, students who hear supervisors and professors, like, say some of these terms, they're like, wait, this is really because, people pick up and start repeating the things that they hear.
Yeah. I agree with that. And also, I just think using, language, right? I sort of like thinking about the Panthers leading by example. So, like, using the language that we want to use is really important too.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. Somebody like this was called a frequent flyer and a borderline personality disorder, and, lots of different sort of, negative terms that I think I'm not, and I think that there's a lot of internalized depression that leads to people doing stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we had just started putting into place our liberation health method, and the first thing that we did was to sort of talk to this person and identify what it was that was preventing them from living, the life that they wanted to live. And one of the things that they said was they felt like they had sort of a lump of pain, like, sort of like inside of them that was interfering in everything. And so the first intervention was to stop calling the person by their diagnosis, right? Because, in a hospital, we have rounds every morning, and every morning one of the residents will say, this is a 63-year-old Latina woman who, is blah, blah, blah. But we sort of, with fidelity to our model, we wanted to sort of use patient first language, right? And, or really what the person wanted to be called. And what they said is what they were experiencing was this sort of, ball of nerves. I think it was actually a ball of nerves that that was getting in the way of their functioning. And so that's how the person was identified every morning in rounds. And boy, was that a switch just from pathologizing the person themselves, to saying this is, a 17-year-old Latina woman that is experiencing a ball of nerves that's getting in the way of her functioning. And that shift of talking about it that way, like everybody on the team talking about it that way, enabled them to interface with the patient very differently. And I use the word patient only because that's the word that was used in the hospital. Everybody's a patient there. It's not the word I use in my practice. So from there, we did a triangle, right? And there were, the personal factors, again, very typical medical model stuff. Lots of conflict with the dad who was working in someplace in Hong Kong and, would only come back like for a couple of days a week. just, a history of anxiety and, the mom, the daughter, just very typical sort of what I would say, personal factors. But then we got into the cultural, the ideological factors, and they were incredible. Like talking with the dad about gender roles, and the dad had this, like I said, the dad had this job where he was in Hong Kong, most of the week, actually for sometimes weeks at a time, and he was only home for a couple of days. And we sort of talked a lot about why he did that. He didn't really like the long commute. It was like a very long plane ride and everything, but he felt like he needed to do that to provide for his family. And then, the neighborhood he lived in, meant that providing for the family was like having a big house and having a car. So we discussed lots of different sort of gender role messaging around tying your value to external things and how men are encouraged to do that. So gender role messaging was huge for the dad and also for the client, because the client had really never seen herself as a typical girl, right? And this was in a time, like I said, I would do this very differently because this was a time before there was a lot of consciousness about trans issues. And it was the focus at that point was around sort of sexual orientation. And, she talked about how she had a long history of, sort of like not feeling like she fit in, not wanting to play with dolls, this whole sort of thing. And we talked about, again, messages about, what constitutes, right? How can you be who you are and, be doing all these different things, and playing with dolls may be something that's not like in your, on your radar screen. Like, does that mean you're less than? And so we got into a lot of gender role messaging stuff with the client in particular, and also a little bit about, I have to say, the racism that they experienced was a factor that wasn't a big piece of the discussion. It was much more about classism and individualism and the gender roles and heteronormativity and things like that. So there were all these different factors, right? And then we talked about the institutions, right? And she wasn't a typical learner. She, the schools, of course, cater to one kind of learning, right? If you can't sit still for 6 hours at a time, you're made to feel less than. And that was her experience. She felt like dumb and things like that. So there was the schools, there was the sort of capitalist system with the dad, there was the hospital, there was the mental health treatment. So all these different factors, and getting that on the triangle for her was like, it was many years ago that we did this. I can still remember her face, like, oh, this is all a bunch of, bullshit, like I don't have to, this doesn't mean I'm less than, or so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the interventions which involved, again, identifying the dominant worldview message, deconstructing it, introducing new information, rescuing the historical memory of change, and activism as a therapeutic intervention, really transformed the family in so many different ways. Like, for one, the dad decided he didn't need to keep that job in Hong Kong, and he could actually do okay, in a smaller house closer to home, where he would see his daughter a little bit more. And the daughter got sort of connected with, it wasn't a group at her school, but it was a different school. I'm trying to remember the name. It was like a gay straight alliance, and she got connected to that. And she was then through there got connected with other people that were sort of, understanding gender in a way that she did. And she left the hospital, and she did not go back to the hospital, which was pretty amazing because, that was her history, and became very involved with this group of people. And I actually saw her maybe a couple of years later. I almost didn't recognize her because she looked so different. She was wearing gendered, like male clothing instead of, different clothing. And her hair was really short, and she was at an animal rights protest, and the only reason she recognized me, I didn't recognize her. I recognized her from her voice. Her voice was the same. And she said, hey, like she was excited to see me and things like that. And she says, hey, we're going to the, to some, building to just talk about the animals. Do you want to come? And I looked at my watch and I had about like a half an hour and I was like, sure. So I had never gone to an animal, that's just not an area I've been involved in. So I went, I picked up a sign, kind of went along with her, and that was that. And it was just, I haven't seen her since. And, I think that I can say the work around, deconstructing dominant worldview messages, just identifying them and not focusing on the trauma history, which she did have, was transformational for her and turned her into, as Paulo Freire would say, a subject in her own life, protagonist.
It's an incredible story. I'm sure you have just so many others, right? It's really, really powerful. I hope, people listening or reading the transcript are going to want to learn more. So I want to make sure we also, we share that, and I can put links, in the show notes and the website, but how can people learn more about the model and if they want to get trained in the model?
Yeah, well, the easiest way to learn more about the model is to join our Liberation Health group, right? And so we have a website, www.bostonliberationhealth.org. And we have a Facebook group, and we also have a listserv. So if you don't do social media, you still can join. And the great thing about, our current sort of historical moment is that we used to have our meetings, in person. We still do have in-person meetings, but we also have them remotely. And so, for example, on Friday we have monthly meetings. We have a meeting remotely, and we alternate our meetings. We meet monthly, except for July and August. We take the summer off. And every other month is a case presentation. So or a clinical situation, someone will describe someone or a group of people that they're working with, or maybe it's a systems issue. And we do a triangle together, right? And then we break down into small groups and talk about liberation health interventions. So everybody is welcome to that, attend that meeting. And I think that's free. And so, you can connect with other liberation health practitioners. I know a really good friend of yours has come to our meetings, and we've really enjoyed having her and learning from her. And there are people, like, there's 2,800 people in this group, so you don't need to be on the same time zone. Just need to come and click on your Zoom link at the same time zone as us, which is 7:00. And then there's the book. We wrote a book on social justice and clinical practice, a liberation health framework for social work, and I'm sure there's ways to access the book that don't involve spending a lot of money. There's trainings. We go to universities, we go to hospitals, we go to agencies, and we train. We have a number of different trainings that we do in the model. And so you can get all that information. There's a training request form on our website. And I think there's a number of articles on our website as well that you can just download, and the PDFs are free.
That's awesome. So yeah, I'll put those links on there. And something I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is, I think sometimes when people think of social work, right, they think of I'm just going to try to put this all out there because sometimes I have a hard time verbalizing this idea, and this is something like Charla Yearwood, who I work closely with, talks about a lot. But for example, this idea of white people are helping within these disadvantaged communities, right? But this model, we need liberation health because marginalized people need a model like this, right? But this model is liberating for people that are in dominant positions as well, like the father, who also was dealing with some oppressive conditions, because we all are on very, I'm not saying it's all the same for everybody. We know it's not. I don't get pulled over because of the color of my skin, right? I don't worry about that. Or being killed by police for that. There's, but Sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, what I was going to say is that like we all grew up under racial capitalism and we all were exposed to those toxic ideas 24/7, right? And
Totally.
so your social location and identity is a factor in how you've experienced those ideas and the institutions that interface with you. But like unless your parents like just raised you in a bubble and you never left, right? Everybody experiences these toxic ideas. Everybody has the cop in their head. And we all need help. We need each other, right? That we need a collective response to deconstruct that and develop these new stories.
Yeah, and like so many of us who are working within these, I mean, all of these institutions have this too, right? And so like if you're going to try to do something outside of that, or like even if someone's like, like my job's so frustrating, whatever, it's like, well, maybe look at like why it's frustrating. It's probably tied to like some of it. Like I'd be willing to put money on like that it's connected to some, and I don't gamble, but I'd be willing to put money that it's connected to some of this, or the person who's driving you crazy is heavily influenced. And so like Charla and I often talk about, liberation from whiteness is healthy for white people. And
absolutely.
And I think that this model, I want folks who are listening, especially white students or, who will be clinicians or just whatever they're doing, or folks, current practitioners, like how to use this with white people, or people that you think are already in like these dominant positions that don't maybe want to talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, so that guy that I just told you about, that family case, was a white man. He had internalized, what it meant to be a successful white man. And it meant, producing for the market at all costs, even at the cost of losing your family.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we, as you said, all of us have internalized these toxic messages, and we need each other to identify them, to deconstruct them, to remember alternative stories. Like, I love the work of so many radical activists that talk about, the White Panthers and I'm trying to remember the other group. There's tons of radical white groups that have been doing amazing work for a really long time. Joe Hill, right? We forget, right? And then I think sometimes students feel like it's not my place, right? Or like, I don't, I'm not being affected by the oppression in the same way. And so it's not my place. And I feel very strongly that the people that are the most directly affected need to lead. That's true, right? Because, they're going to have the wisdom and the direct, experiences. And our job is not one of charity, it's solidarity. We are affected by these institutions as well. And we can't be free, right? Until they're gone.
Yeah, I love that. And like, I also think when you have a model, right? Because yours is a model, so you can say because I think what I hear from a lot of white clinicians, especially, is like, I don't know how to talk about this with white clients. And it's like, but if you say, hey, I use this model and these are the components of the model, so we're going to go through all of them. And this is the model I use. We do this with everybody.
Right.
Boom.
That's
like,
right.
It's like, now you know how to talk about it, and because you're not like, oh, I'm only bringing this up to you because you're white. And like, I already think you're racist or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that would be sort of really interesting to have like another, so we have a steering committee at Liberation Health, and there were 3 white people on the steering committee, and it'd be great to have them sort of talk about their experiences using this model and how comfortable they are, and how, share stories about how people have been transformed as a result of this work. Yeah.
We'll do a follow-up. So I think doing more, and like I said, I think Liberation Health could be its own podcast, like, period, and have like so many episodes, but maybe that's a project we'll talk about to work on later. I want to just cover like one more thing. I always do this and then the episode keeps going. But one of the core aspects to me that it seems is necessary to be able to practice this model is to have an understanding of like these political factors.
Yes.
And so much of education, period, and especially social work education, even though there's those policy courses, does not cover this. So how do you do that with folks?
Yeah. So that is a great example of how this ideology of white supremacy and class and race and, economics has infected our entire school system, right? So lots of times people come into social work school and they're shocked to learn, the stuff that they learned growing up is just not true, right? And there's that great, I don't know if you remember, but there was a group, Simon and Garfunkel, that was, from a long time ago.
No, I know who they are.
Okay. Well, I didn't know. But they have this line, if I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think at all. And I think that that, is really, that's true. And it's nobody's fault.
They were onto something with that line.
Right? So sometimes people get into this state where like they feel really guilty and like, oh my God, I didn't know this. And I feel so bad. And, the guilt sort of just kind of like immobilizes them. And what we say to people is like, of course you didn't know this. It's very intentional that you didn't know this. It'd have to be an extraordinary situation for you to know what was really going on because they keep it from you. And so for us at the school social work, it's really important to be able to present, right, this alternative new information, right? And it's not new per se, but it's often new to new people. So for example, we have a module that we did, a 3-hour module on structural and institutional racism. Every new professor at the school social work has to take that module. They have to do it. It's an online 3-hour module. It's free. Anybody can access it anywhere in the world. Just go to our, I can send you the link to it. And those kinds of things are necessary in order to do this kind of work, because you need to know about these alternative stories. You need to know what you were told, why you were told it, who it benefited, and, these concealed stories of change, liberation, and transformation. Yeah.
In the work that Charlotte and I do, we often hear like, I never learned any of this. Like, why didn't I learn? And we have those conversations, and some of our courses are also like one of them's called Racism Has Always Existed in the United States, right? And it's this historical perspective.
That's right. The United States has never been without it. That's absolutely true.
Exactly. Like it would never exist, right? And without it, right?
That's right.
And I did an interview with Dr. Dedrick Williams. He's at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and that was he talked about how race would not exist without racism. They cannot be separated.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And that also is like something people really need to understand to be able to do this work. For a lot of reasons, but especially to be able to do this work.
Yeah. Did you ever see, I'm going to make my interest in the arts, but did you ever see The Matrix? And you remember when Morpheus has those 2 pills, like you can take the red pill or the blue pill, like that's kind of what it's like. You take this red pill, or I remember the color, and you're going to go down a rabbit hole that like, you're like, whoa.
Yeah, there's
right?
no coming back. Like right? Once you start seeing it through that new lens, you're going to start seeing everything through that lens, which is why the powers that be are fighting people learning all of this, because they don't want people to see it through that lens.
Yep.
I want to thank you so much for your time, for coming on here, and thank you so much for everything you do, for bringing us the Liberation Health model to the world, to the podcast, to the folks listening, reading, following along, and thanks for doing the work.
Well, thank you for doing the work, because you're part of the multiracial working class movement for our collective liberation. So thank you, comrade.
Thank you for listening to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please follow on Twitter and leave positive reviews on iTunes. If you're interested in being a guest or know someone who's doing great work, please get in touch. And thank you for doing real work to make this world a better place.